Welcome to another episode of Season 3 of the Panjwai Podcast. As usual, you can find our episodes on YouTube, Facebook, and your favorite podcast platform, whether that's Spotify or Apple iTunes, iHeartRadio. You pick it, we're there.
If you want to support the podcast financially, we've set up a few ways for you to do so this season. You can become a patron by hopping over to patreon.com/the Panjwai Podcast and sign up for a small monthly donation. If you want to make a one-time donation, you can find us on Venmo at the Panjwai Podcast. And last but not least, we've got a small selection of merchandise in our store. So if you head over to thepanjwaipodcast.com and click on the store tab, you'll see stickers and other merchandise, and who knows what might come down the pipeline.
All that I can hope is you take me with you when you go. I guess I should have known I can't leave with you when you go. Now Cow Island is awfully quiet, with your screen door staying closed. And if I learned French like you told me, baby, I would hear your ghost.
It's funny. I mean, nowadays with YouTube and like this, the whole multimedia aspect of everything, like Curtis and I have talked about this. And so something, I mean, my thing is I like to write, like I love, writing as much as I can. And I've been, the reason I didn't continue down the academic wormhole, talk about the Chinese degree earlier and do the PhD, is because I wanted to take a step back and focus on my own writing. But the question is, like, can you even be an author anymore, or do you have to be a multimedia personality who writing is just a component of that presence, essentially?
Yeah, it's almost like you're selling a brand now. It's not an individual art form, and it's music is like that. Everything's like that. So it's all this. It's like a combined celebrity that allows you to do this one thing, and you're like, it's a branding thing, I guess, but it makes it really difficult. I don't know how you get discovered these days. I don't even know how that works.
I mean, I was talking to a friend of mine.
Lots and lots of
marketing. I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of days ago about that. It's like, where do you bend the knee, and where do you kind of stick to the things that you want to hold true to? Because I mean, I hate that stuff. Like marketing for me is a dirty word, and like I am not a good self promoter. Like I don't have that bone in me at all. I know it's ironic that we're sitting here talking on a podcast, but I mean, to be fair,
a successful podcast too,
as
a result of marketing.
Which Curtis has done all the promotion and all the marketing guru stuff on, but for me, it's just not. I don't have that tick. So maybe I'm just archaic. I'm antiquated, I think, in a lot of ways when it comes to that kind of stuff.
I mean, marketing doesn't have to be a 4-letter word. It's all it really is letting people know that you exist and making sure the right people know about you. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to bend the knee, or you don't have to, or get on a knee. Worse, it just means like, hey, like I'm doing this thing, and the internet makes that possible, and it's literally just a matter of spending money, really. If you're willing to invest money in yourself, people are going to find out about you. It's pretty simple formula.
Is that just so disheartening?
It's no different than it's ever been. I mean, people are always having to advertise themselves. Like we were talking the other day, like Charles Dickens didn't just like write a book, throw it on a shelf, and like hope somebody found it one day. Mm-hmm. I mean, there obviously there were marketing networks back then. There was still word of mouth advertising and storytelling and stuff like that. It's just modernized now.
Well, part of our storytelling here on the Panjwai Podcast is to include a diverse range of guests. And so joining us today is Matt. Matt he comes from a very different background for the Panjwai world. So Matt, normally the way we kick these things off is kind of let you give the elevator spiel of the background for your job. Your job was not in the military, so that kind of, don't give us the elevator spiel. Give us a little bit more on that. Give us the introduction to how you ended up in Panjwai and the kind of work you were doing there.
Yeah, so thanks for having me, guys. Appreciate being on. So I was a Department of the Army civilian employee, so a GS employee. And the role that I took on was to provide intelligence support to conventional and special forces units in Afghanistan. So I was what was considered to be an individual augmentee, meaning I was deployed to Afghanistan, but I didn't actually know any of the units that I'd be working with. And so I'd essentially show up one day. They would know that I was coming, but I wouldn't know any of the people that worked, that were in the units themselves. And my role essentially was to provide a capability that would allow the commander to better understand what some of the social and cultural forces that were at play in their area of operations. So that could be anything from talking to local villagers, local leaders, local governance officials at the district level, and as well as Afghan security forces. So I would go out sometimes on combat patrols with guys like yourself, and go out and have access to those in the village, kind of see what's going on. I would go to district police compounds, army compounds, district governance facilities, talk to the people there. Lots of shuras, and then ultimately then report back to the commander for whatever the unit was that I worked with. And I worked through a couple of different units while I was in Afghanistan, and basically take my orders from the commander or the senior NCO in terms of kind of what they needed, and just run with it from there. So that's in a nutshell what I did.
Nah, I mean, but they weren't your boss, so you took guidance from them. But like, if they told you like, "Hey, hop in this vehicle and go to this base," you'd be like, "Nah, bro." Like, how did that work? I mean, obviously you don't want to like play that card, but at the same time, like, it's like, "Hey, I'm here to help you, but I don't work for you."
I never really thought of it that way. It's an interesting point. So I did have my own civilian command structure, if you will. So I had a team leader that was my direct boss, if you will. And then there was an upper level, an upper echelon leadership cadre that was either at Kandahar Airfield, and then there was an even higher echelon group of leadership at Bagram. So I would say that at the local level, I would not be able to tell the commander. I guess I could tell him I wasn't going to go, but he'd probably say like, "Well, I'm not sure if this is going to work out," you know?
Right.
So I would never have done, unless it was something that was, extreme. I mean, there was no instance where I would have said, "Nah, I can't do that," because ultimately my job was to support him and his men, right? So I'm there for that reason, and if he needs me to go out and do something, as long as it's within the realm of what I'm allowed to do, then I'm going to do it. So I never had any issues along those lines.
So when you say within the realm of what you're allowed to do, like, what do you mean by that? What were you allowed and not allowed to do?
Yeah, so it's when you're civilian, it's a little bit different, right? So everyone has basically the same rules of engagement. So I did carry firearms, so that's probably an important distinction to make, right? So, but I'm not there to be an offensive capability. So I have those weapons for defensive purposes, so I'm allowed to use them for those purposes. But I'm not supposed to be going out on offensive operations where like I would be explicitly
not kicking in the door and running the mine detector up front.
Now, if that happened and I was there and it was just necessary to do it for defensive reasons, that's a whole different story. But I wouldn't be allowed to do that with that explicit offensive purpose, and I wasn't supposed to do collection on, I guess, purposeful collection on the red side, so on adversary forces that would lead to targeting, for example. So it is interesting because you really can't control what people tell you, and ultimately you might get information that really isn't in my lane. And this did happen, and then the guidance was that if you get information that needs to be passed on related to enemy activity, let's say, that could result in some sort of offensive capability being used, I pass that on to the 2 shop. I say, hey, this is what I heard. This is what I found.
Right.
It's not really in my lane. I give it to the guys in the intel shop, and then they do whatever they do with it.
Sure. Yeah, because I mean, if you're trying to dive through like the cultural activities and societal, I don't know, norms of the Pashto villages in that area, you're going to run into that. You're going to be like, oh yeah, that guy's Taliban. Oh yeah, that's where his IED factor. Like you're gonna stumble across that stuff. You can't dive into neighborhood affairs in Panjwai and not find Taliban.
Yeah, that's right. And the people that you're talking to, they don't know what my job is. They don't know what my role is. So
they probably just think you're a lieutenant.
Yeah. Well, outside of the beard, probably was the giveaway. With the conventional guys, it was a giveaway. But I would have guys come up to me that when I was working with 7th Group, so that's Army Special Forces. Guys would come up to me, local nationals, and they would just like tell me, hey, I need you. This guy, I'm getting harassed. Here's a phone number that keeps calling me, and they're saying they're going to kill me. Like, can you do anything about this? So they don't know me from anyone else, right? So they just give me that information, and I pass it on to the 2 shop, and they do whatever they do with it.
Now, to back up, and before we go too deep in, how did you come by this? Like what brought you to this role? Your education background. I mean, just to find out about the job. How did that play out?
Yeah, so I was in graduate school, and this was around 2010, and this is just after the recession and sequestration and everything, and so hiring in the federal workspace is pretty diminished at that point. And I wanted the job that was either in the intel world, maybe DOD, maybe something with federal law enforcement. And it was really hard to even get your foot in the door at that point in time. So I was just kind of looking around trying to figure out, like, what am I going to do after I get out of grad school in 2011? And this guy that I was friends with, he said, hey, there's this job that I just looked at, and it sounds like based on your background. So I had a background in research, psychological research, and then was doing a master's in international affairs. And he said, I think with that combination, this job would be really, you'd be competitive for this job. So I looked at it, and it was really unusual. It's like, you go in, you get hired, you do some training, and then you deploy downrange. At that time, it was to either Iraq or Afghanistan. You work directly with NATO forces on the ground, and you get to go out and you get to talk to people in those countries at the local level. So I thought that was like fascinating. Like, who gets to do this, right? So I looked into it and submitted an application, and I checked all the boxes. At that point, I was in my early 30s. I was married, but I didn't have kids, so I wasn't really encumbered at that point, with responsibilities domestically. And so I was able to do it. And it was I could talk about. I mean, there's a training component to it. It was a couple year process ultimately. Right. But that's how I found out about the job and the academic background I had that got my foot in the door.
And there was not necessarily like a basic training, but kind of like a gentleman's course version of basic training that went along with that, right? Yeah.
So there was it was 6 months of training in total. So it was a 3-month training period, classroom training at Fort Leavenworth. That was like kind of like DOD to 101, like how to understand like who
rank
like exactly, like how the military works. And also some nuts and bolts about the job we were going to do. And after that, then it was a 3-month boot camp at Fort Polk. So the training class was comprised of, it was half and half military civilians. So there was us, people that were doing the type of job I was doing, I guess about 25 of us. And then there was about 25 Air Force and Navy personnel that were, I think, mostly medical personnel. Right.
Medical or legal.
Yeah. So the training itself at Polk is actually really useful for me because I'm not prior military. So they kind of gave you a crash course on a lot of the different things you might encounter or need to be able to do if you're with warfighters and you're out in a war. So we had to qualify with M4 and the M9. To do some IED training, a lot of IED training actually, learn how to clear rooms. do some KLE training. That's because it's a big part of what we actually did. And then we had language training as well. So kind of a lot of the same stuff that I would imagine that you guys would have done in training, but just not at the intensity level that you guys would have done it at. If I could
you might have gotten more than we did.
Yeah, you probably got better quality training than we did. That's for damn sure.
Yeah.
How many push-ups did you do in that 6-week period of time, or 6 months?
We weren't required to do PT. That was the only thing. I could work out.
Got better quality.
I could work out on my own. Which was nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, everything else was. Like I said, it was useful. Like all the stuff that they taught us, I used most of that. I mean, NVG training, we had to learn how to shoot with those on. We had to learn how to operate with those. Like trying to drive with those things on is
it's a different ball of wax.
It's pretty hard. But I felt like I could do it after I got to training. So ultimately, it was not at the intensity that you guys would have gone through, but it served its purpose.
There's the proof in the pudding right there, because you know where I learned to drive under MVGs? Iraq.
We had a private that drove his very first vehicle ever. Not like a car. He didn't even have a driver's license. First thing he ever drove was a 38,000-pound MATV on a combat mission.
He did not.
He crashed.
He was not a good driver. So, I mean, you went into this job knowing full and well you were going to go to either Iraq or Afghanistan. So, what was your kind of thought process for where you might end up? Because I'm assuming that you don't really know. You could be in the middle of CAF eating Pizza Hut every day, or you could end up in Panjwai, or you could be in Bagram or Jalalabad or whatever. So, what was your kind of mind game, or how did you process, I could end up being in a really bad place?
So they actually, they let us put in preferences for where we wanted to be deployed ultimately. So I was of the opinion I wanted to be where, this is the 2012, 2013 timeframe. So I wanted to be somewhere where there was actually still, I felt like there was more of a chance for me to make a difference. It was still kind of an active area, if you will, not somewhere that was more settled. So I put in a preference to go to Kandahar or Helmand, southern Afghanistan in general, just based on that premise. And then, so of course they initially assigned me to Mazar-e-Sharif after I had put that preference in. It's like the complete opposite of what I was looking for, right? So,
right.
So that was what they assigned me to. So I just was like, well, okay, I guess I'll go to Mazar-e-Sharif. It'll be beautiful, and the Germans are there, and I'll hang out with them, and that's that. But they ended up cutting that team, that location, and then they shuffled some people around, and they were like, okay, do you want to go to Kandahar? I said, yeah, that's where I want to go. And they said, okay, well, you're going to go to Panjwai. And I knew what Panjwai was. I knew the reputation. So I what
had you heard?
Yeah.
Birthplace of the Taliban, one of the most active kinetic areas in the country, statistically at least, which was, based on what I saw statistically, was accurate. I mean, it was one of
the stats matched up.
Yeah. So that was basically it. But just the reputation of it being like a Taliban, like an ideological stronghold, if you will. That was well known, but it was hard to find a lot of detailed information online at that point. It was some stuff about some of the Canadian operations that had happened, but wasn't anything in detail really.
And the Bales event had already happened at this point too, right?
Yeah, that had already happened. So that was, I guess I would have known about that at the time as well. Yeah. Well, so I mean, after I found out I was going to go down there, it did reorient my thought a little bit, because if you think you're going to go to a calmer area, you're not quite as, maybe approach that a little bit differently. It's a little more relaxed. Once I found I was going to Panjwai, I was just, I know I talked to a lot of the guys that I was in training with that were civilians at the time, but they were prior military.
Right.
Good buddy that was a Marine. He'd been in a number of, he'd been in Fallujah and a bunch of other places, and couple other Army guys that had been in combat, and I was just kind of talk to them and just ask them a lot of questions about like, hey, what do you, how should I approach this? How do I set my kit up? Like what kind of gear do I need? Because I had some flexibility as a civilian. Like they gave us all the same stuff that they gave to you guys as issue, which but a lot of it's like, if I don't have to wear this, I'm not going to wear it, kind of stuff. So
nice to have that option.
Yeah.
Like long sleeve shirts.
Right. So like I wanted to be able to run and not that. So I bought a plate carrier so I'd have something a little bit lighter. So I was able to do all that stuff, but I was able to talk to guys that knew what they were doing and be like, hey, what should I buy? Like, I don't really know. And like, what kind of holster would you get for the M9? Because the one they give you is like a canvas box and it doesn't work. And
I remember that.
So it was that kind of stuff, I guess, like preparation wise, hitting the gym really hard just to make sure I was in really good shape. My wind was up, that I wasn't going to be a physical liability. So I didn't show up, to like meet you guys on the first day and you look at me and you're like, really? Like this guy's going to go out with us? I didn't want to be that guy. So
Right.
So I took that really seriously because that's not only for my well-being, but for the guys I was going to be with, for their well-being, to make sure like we're all on the same page, like in terms of like physical capability, and like I'm not going to be a drag on anybody. So that was probably one of the big. Yeah,
I'm sure the dudes you worked with were appreciative of that, because anytime the word civilian came down the pipeline, you begin to worry just about those particular issues. Like, oh, can this guy slog it out? Hell, not even civilian, just certain jobs.
I was thinking about the combat cameraman.
Yeah, exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, it's like they said, oh, you're gonna have a combat photographer attached to you on this patrol. We're like, oh shit, here we go. Like, we're gonna have to like sling load this dude out of a Grape Rose somewhere.
And the irony is, the first one we got was legit. He was really good. He was really fit.
Yeah,
and he was like a former infantryman. I was like, all right. And the second one we got was not. That's all we'll say about him. We took him on the easiest patrol we could possibly take him on. All flat, all fields, no Grape Rose, nothing. Literally like a half a mile out and back.
He was wrecked.
Like, he fell out. I'm like,
yeah,
oh my
he was
God,
destroyed. So I'm sure the guys you fell in with really appreciated you.
Yeah.
Having the foresight to think about that too. So
to ask the questions, not just assume. Yeah.
So when
do you remember your first patrol?
There were so many grouped together at one time at the beginning that not explicitly, but they kind of a lot of them blend together, because some of them, it's like nothing happened and you just like every village kind of looks the same.
They do.
Sort of. So yeah, it might have been like it was probably, I can't remember actually. It might have just been like, I think I had gone to some, like I'd been up to Spirwan Gar at some point just for like a shura, but it wasn't like a patrol, it was just going up for a meeting. But there was a flurry of patrols I went on, and would have been November through January in particular. That was when I was at Masum Ghar. And so I was with conventional guys at that point in time. And there went around to a number of different bases. So went out to like Deshoja and Kinjikak, went out to Speen Boldax outside of Panjwai, but went out there for a few weeks. And then probably did the most running around between Speen Boldak and I guess it would have been Chaos Company, I think, out of Kinjikak, if I remember it right. I think that's who it was. 132. I may have this wrong. Does that sound right?
I think it was 138.
138. Yeah. Sorry.
They're the ones that replaced us. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So those guys were. We went out with those guys a bunch of times, and they had a pretty austere setup there. They didn't have. That was the most austere location I was at for sure. It was, ration food and no heat in the tent in January that we were in. I mean, it was. They didn't have any creature comforts there at all, but they were going out like every day. So we got to go out with those guys a bunch of times.
How did the terrain? What was your reaction to the terrain? Well, I mean, what were you expecting, and what was, after you walked around on a few patrols, what was kind of your response? Yeah,
the Grape Rose were challenging. So did a couple patrols through those. that were several kilometers in distance, and with all that gear on, that wears on you. I mean, that's a long slog when you've got, whatever, 50 or 60 or more pounds of gear rattling around. You're trying to jump over those things. But yeah, just the look of the Panjwai, it's such a weird place. You've got these like sort of mini mountains, if you will, and then it's all just flat and there's no trees, maybe because the Soviets took care of that in the 80s. I'm guessing
that was the rumor that I heard.
That's what I'd heard, that they defoliated a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was not the easiest terrain to walk around, but it was the nice thing was, I guess, is that you could see pretty clearly. I mean, it was relatively open, so it didn't feel claustrophobic, like you're in a dense wooded area or something and you can't see in front of you. This is a lot of this is in the winter time, so there's not as much foliage.
Yeah. I was wondering about that.
So I can think of a few times.
But that makes sense. I mean, the winter it would open up so much, I would think, because the leaves would be off the trees and the grape rose would be dead. I mean, it would be like a barren wasteland out there then.
Yeah.
I know one thing always stood out to me was just there was you could never walk for more than 100 meters without having some sort of obstacle, whether it was a canal or a wall or a grape row or a tree or a tree line or something. Like, unless you were walking on a road, which was a terrible idea. I don't know if that was hopefully that you didn't spend too much time walking on those.
No, we didn't. We typically we're on foot and trying to just stay off the beaten path. And I mean, I'm just following the the EOD lead. Wherever they tell me to go, I'm going. But yeah, we generally stayed off any of the major thoroughfares, and the villages are it's crazy. You walk into these villages for the first time, and it's just like going back to it's like biblical times. You can't. It's almost like unbelievable how even though you've seen pictures of it, once you walk out there and you realize like people live here. This is
real.
This is real. This is not like a mock village, and these are all mud walls that people built themselves. There's no electricity, there's no running water, except maybe the mosque speaker. I mean, they've got some electricity, but I mean, basically there's no infrastructure at all. And
I have a very distinct memory of looking through the windshield of a Mad V, and it wasn't a far leap of the imagination to think I was on another planet. I was thinking like, this is what it would be like to go to another planet and
Moss Isley, man.
Yeah,
Panjwai is Moss Isley.
It really
looks just like it.
Yeah,
I felt that way when I got off the plane at CAF, when I had just gotten there, and I got off the plane and I looked around, and there's all the blimps up in the air and the mountains, and I was just like, where am I? I know I'm supposed to be here, but this is kind of surreal at the same time. And then you go in and you go into that old Soviet terminal, I guess, that they built.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah.
And I'm just like, man, I can't believe I'm actually here. It's took a few days to settle in and get over the jet lag and everything. But it was, it's pretty bizarre. Once you actually step foot into that environment, and it's just like nothing I've ever seen before. It's totally foreign.
Probably nothing like you'll ever see again unless you go to another that same part of the world. I mean, even East Africa has more modern infrastructure and equipment. And if you really want your mind blown, when I went back in 2017, pretty much every backyard in Panjwai had a solar panel and lights. There were lights when you flew over Panjwai. It was the craziest thing.
Wow.
Yeah.
Huh. That's amazing. That's
some
awesome.
NGO paid billions of dollars to put solar panels in everybody's backyard because everybody had them.
Wow. Huh.
Yeah, pretty wild. Now, so obviously you're going on these patrols, but you're basically a passenger until you get into the village, and that's kind of when your work starts, right?
Yeah. So usually I would have a list of questions that I would want to ask. So if we're driving into the village, I'm a passenger. We get out, go into the village, and I'm basically following the unit's lead. So if you guys tell me like, hey, we need to leave, then I leave. I don't, ultimately my job is to, for security purposes, I follow what you guys are telling me to do. But I'm looking ultimately when I get into a village to talk to people that either look like they might have insight, or people that we haven't seen before, or that no one knows who this guy is, maybe someone of interest. And then, you just kind of shoot the breeze with people in general. Just try to talk to kids sometimes too, because they're a little more open with what they say. Kind of assess the atmospherics of the situation. There are a lot of people out. Is it dead? Do people seem relaxed? Did it seem like people were expecting us? And yeah, ultimately, for those initial 4 months that I was there with the conventional unit, it was a pretty broad mandate to go in and just kind of talk to people generally about the security situation, elicit any insights they had into the effectiveness of the local government, any gripes they had, so if somebody starts to, if you start to key in on somebody talking about something, they're complaining, try to bring more of that out, right? Try to open up the conversation a little bit. And, sometimes you find out interesting things that are going on, like a water dispute or something between two villages, that just might be good for us to be aware of. And that was my whole focus. So, you guys are, when you're out, you guys are worried about security. You're worried about, the enemy. And my job was to worry about the local population as much as possible. And, you guys are obviously watching my back while I'm doing that. But, I was able to be able to focus specifically on that. And that was my entire job. Whereas, I knew you guys had a lot of other roles and responsibilities. It didn't allow you to maybe focus as fully on that. So that's basically what I would do in those situations.
Yeah, I mean, you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but there was a clear demarcation in what you were doing there too. Like, you weren't there to gather, like I said, gather evidence to build target packages. Like, you were there purely as a support. So, what were some of the really distinctive differences between the kind of intelligence that you gathered versus what maybe the typical infantryman would think of as intelligence gathering?
I think ultimately the lines probably blurred quite a bit because you can't really control what people start talking about. So I would imagine you guys were probably asking a lot of the same questions. But your goal, I guess, would be, your end game would be different than what mine was potentially.
Yeah.
So
our end game was to kill a motherfucker.
Right. Yeah. And
I think about like the LTs, like when the LTs are doing their KLEs, I bet they're asking a lot of the same questions, but they're probably, their scope is really small. So like they're worried about this village, this RAO, the villages that we go to. Whereas you're trying to get like a broader picture of like all the villages, all the Pashto people, all the tribes that are in Panjwai and Kandahar. It's like you're piecing, I feel like correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like you're piecing together a bigger picture. Whereas the LTs are like, hey, I need to know who this guy is, and if we can make this guy our friend.
Yeah, well, and part of that would be trying to just, keep an updated map of who's who in these different villages, because it's really difficult to keep track of who these guys even are, right? So you could have a leadership change at a village, at the village level, and not know about it. And so you might have a different elder or a group of people that are now in charge. So if you can figure that out, if you can figure out who's in charge, it might be useful either at the present, so you're meeting with the right people when you're in the village, or at least somewhere down the line when you're trying to figure out, who do we talk to when there's a problem in this particular area. So I think a lot of it was just trying to some of it was because you don't know if people telling you the truth. Some of it's trying to just use your eyes and figure out who looks like they might be somebody, but at the same time trying to talk to enough people that you can kind of triangulate potentially who's who, and maybe come out with a better sense for who some of the important players are in a particular area. But you have so little time. Sometimes you go into a village, you might only have an hour or less, depending on what happens. And I found it was very challenging. You could walk in there with the script, and it pretty much never panned out that way. I mean, you had to improvise,
think on your feet.
Totally. And just go with what happens. So, I don't know if that answers your question, Curtis, but it's
no, it very much does. And it gave me another question. We had heard that the village names change often based on the elders that are in charge. Is that true?
I had not heard that.
Okay, it's probably not true.
Well, it may be. I mean, I don't think I had heard that, but that's certainly possible. But I
think like the smaller villages, obviously like the big ones like Sketcha or Talakan or Adam's Eye. Obviously those never change, but like there are like little ones, like the one that comes to mind is Haji Gul Muhammad. That sounds like a name to me.
Yeah.
And I remember something weird. Like we went there once. We're like, oh, we're going to Haji Gul Muhammad. I was like, oh no, this used to be Haji Gul Muhammad, but Haji Gul Muhammad moved to that village, so now that's Haji Gul Muhammad. I was like, what? Like I don't know if it was real or not. I may have just like misheard it or something, but it was. I do remember the village name thing. I was like, man, that sounds like a person's name.
It's possible, and it's. I mean, there would be like these sub-tribes of clans basically that we would hear. We were like, what? I've never even heard of this before. Like, what is this? And I couldn't tell if they were messing with us or if it was actually like a real group of people and that was the name of their clan. But
right.
I mean, there's only like so many levels we were able to like drill down and understand. And at a certain point, it's like you're talking about like individual families, and,
right.
And I don't think we ever got. I think we barely
understanding.
I don't think so. We barely had an understanding of like the top level stuff,
right.
Even after like at the time I was there after 12 years. I think there was a lot below that we never figured out, and we probably never would have.
No, I mean, yeah, think about it. I mean, if the Russians invaded, Alaska tomorrow, how long would it take them to figure out like who every family is and who owns every single business and like they'll know the big players, the big families, or the people that are the politicians and the police chief and stuff like that. But they're not gonna know what Curtis Grayson does in his cabin, not unless he does something really interesting. Which Russians, I would do something very interesting. You would know who I am. But there was a lot of levels of people in Panjwai. You had, like you said, you had like the big players, the politicians, but you had like the Kuchis, who were like the nomadic tribes. You had like you had immigrants, you had Pakistanis that didn't live there, and I don't know. It's how was it trying to navigate like who belongs and who was relevant?
It's very difficult. I mean, you could get a general sense. We had heat maps that we built over time that tried to break down tribal affiliations across the district, and I don't know how they did that or validated any of that. I couldn't make any sense of it, honestly. It was hard to figure out. I mean, you only talk to such a small sample of people. So it's like, right. Well, this guy said he's a Sockeye, so okay, I guess he is. But I imagine at some point they probably surveyed the area, sent some people out, tried to get a sense for what the kind of a census was for the area. But
do you remember how many tribes there were?
Not specifically, no. No, I mean, there was, like I said, there was a heat map that kind of broke down. I mean, it's all Pashtun, right, for the most part.
Sure,
I mean,
right.
99%.
Yeah.
But beyond that, I mean, it's like, it depends. Are you talking about like a high level super confederation, or how far down do you want to break it out, right? Then it gets more complicated, where you get down to like the clan level. And I feel like we barely had a sense for like what it looked like just at a macro level.
Yeah.
And so it almost, I don't know how important it ultimately was to some of the things that we were doing. I thought it was going to make a big difference to like understand all those dynamics. And it did to some extent. I shouldn't minimize it. Like understanding like that there's tension between Norzai and Achaksai, that matters, right? Because there's a traditional tension between those two groups. And it's explainable. And if you know the history, you can understand where that comes from and why one group is aligned with the Taliban primarily and why one has been aligned with NATO forces primarily. And that does provide insight that's useful. And it's useful to know a little bit about the Asaksai and kind of how they were marginalized historically and what their reputation is, how they were tied to the Taliban very strongly. That was the kind of stuff that I keyed on more than anything. Once it got down below that level, it was like, well, that's interesting, but I don't think it's really going to help us do anything. So it was almost like a distraction at that point. So it kind of runs contrary to what you would think I was trying to do. But I learned pretty quickly that wasn't going to help you guys out to do your job very much, unless it was tied to something very specific. So the examples I just gave are more of what I focused on.
And I almost feel like the more micro you get, like the less permanent. You know, like if you're getting down to like, well, that guy doesn't like that guy. It's like, well, they might change their mind next week. But you can get to like the higher level
or
clans.
one of them might catch a hellfire next week, or
it's a good chance of that too.
So I mean, that's so one of the things, like, I'm intrigued by the academic aspect of what you were doing, but in reality, you're forming a kind of academic research mentality in a war zone. So for you, like on a personal level, like how did you balance the academics / investigative aspect of it with just the sheer brutality and reality of being in a place where war was going on?
So when I got there, what I tried to do was apply, and what I was supposed to do was apply more traditional research methodology to develop a better understanding of what was going on. And I did that for a few months, and I wrote some papers and did some more like longitudinal studies that looked at that were looking at data that spanned across a lot of different participants, multiple months. Wrote a big white paper up. This was related to the concept of professionalism amongst Afghan national security forces. Mm-hmm. And it was a really good paper, but I don't think ultimately it resonated at all with the audience. It was methodologically sound. It was done the way you should do research in a methodological sense. But what I found was that the audience I'm working for is the military, and you guys have very specific needs. And what I found was actually more useful, rather than doing these longer pieces, was just doing a sit rep every day. And if something really stuck out, go talk to the commander and say, hey, I think we should maybe write like a 5-page paper up on this and get it distroed out to everybody. It might actually be useful.
Right.
But I didn't. I tried to do things the more academic way initially, and I think things just took too long. The papers were too long, and I'm not sure if it was just digestible enough for a lot of people, given how fast things are going every day. Everything's moving so quickly.
Right.
So
they're not going to take the time to read it. Maybe
they're not going to take the time to do it, and so I have to say I just kind of changed my tune. And one of my team leaders, when I moved over to work with 7th Group, he was like, "Hey, we're going to do a sit rep every day. That's the format we're going to use to communicate information. And if we can expound on that or expand on that, we'll do it. But it's a military audience. These guys need stuff quick, and they need it to be brief and factual, and just like, your opinion. If you want to put a couple things in there, that's fine, but let's keep it tight."
Right.
And I found that it was actually far more effective than trying to do that in talking to people directly. So briefing guys on the ground, talking to them individually or in small groups, was a lot more effective than my research approach. So I kind of honestly, I didn't totally throw it out the window. I still kept some of that rigor, but I had to adapt to that environment, because there just wasn't enough time to do things in a way that I would do them back in the US if I was like formulating a study and, trying to get something through an IRB and like write this long paper. Just forget it. It just didn't work.
I mean, so to kind of just pick up on that, what you were first talking about, that first paper and that first little bit of research that you did where you focused on the Afghan security forces, one of the things that made a big impression on us was that the Afghan army that we worked with were not from southern Afghanistan. They were from, basically, ethnically, they were Uzbek or Tajik or whatever. They were from the far-flung northern regions of the country. So is this something that you were able to do a little research on and digging on, or is this something that you noticed? I mean,
yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I did talk to a lot of guys, especially there was a lot of Hazara in particular that I remember being down when I was at Speen Boldak and at Panjwai, and so
Break down the Hazara thing a little bit, if you don't care.
Yeah, so the Hazara is the main distinction, is that they're Shia. So, you have within Islam, generally speaking, you've got Sunni and Shia. It's kind of the equivalent of Protestant and Catholic, right? They're both Muslim, but they don't get along necessarily. They have some different beliefs, and some Sunnis would consider Shia to be heretical. They have very strong disagreements about their interpretation of Islam. So, and they look very different. So Hazara, if you look at a Hazara man and a Pashtun man, they have very different features. Hazara men look more Asian, I would say. And so they're very distinct, and it's easy to tell. You can tell the two apart by the physical characteristics. So, but the religious piece is probably that's the main driver of differences between the two, and they live in different parts of the country. Mm-hmm. But in talking to some of the Hazara police and soldiers, I did ask them, does it make a difference that you're Hazara and you're in a Pashtun area? How does that factor into how you do your job? And they said that it was helpful because there were so many people that were connected by lineage that were Pashtun in Panjwai or Speen Boldak, wherever I was, that it made corruption more of a problem because people knew each other, whether it was through cross-border trade or if it was just in the local area. So those guys felt like they could do their job without as much bias because they didn't know people in the area. And I think that was the logic in sending people from different ethnic backgrounds into different parts of the country. So you didn't have as much cronyism. Not sure how effective it was, but at least there weren't those direct connections. Right. So I know it was hard for those guys because they were far away from their family. They didn't see their families for a long time. And it was tough for them to be so far away and in such a foreign place. I mean, I wouldn't imagine any of them had spent much or any time in that part of the country their entire life. So, and they didn't get to go.
Very different.
Very different. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know one thing we noticed, and we talked to Rusty Bradley a couple months ago on like an informal, a pre-interview, and he was like, man, like if they weren't from Kandahar, they just didn't fight as hard. So you had a trade-off. You had they weren't as exposed to the corruption, and they weren't doing side deals out of their pockets, but they also, at least, and this was kind of our experience with our ANA, our personal ANA, was that, man, getting them to work was tough.
Yeah.
They weren't really motivated. Like like you said, they're far from home. Like, this isn't their people. This isn't their land. They miss their family. They never get to go home. They are already not getting paid much at all. So that's one thing we keyed in on personally. It was that I agree with you. I see why they chose to do it. That's how we do it in our military. We send people all over the country. If you're from Texas, you can get stationed in California. Suck it up, Buttercup. It just didn't seem to be as effective. What about? So we were talking a little bit in the pre-interview about the beard, and I really would like. I know this is obviously you wore one when you were with both the SOF and the conventional forces. But when you also got to observe the differences in the way that the SOF and conventional forces were treated. Give us our glorious justification for having beards in Panjwai. Yeah,
I mean, I think that you guys should have been allowed to grow beards out. That's the bottom line, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is that the beard is a sign of Pashtun culture, and a lot of cultures for that matter, but of transition from being a boy to a man, right? So once you can grow your beard out, it's a sign that you become a man, right? So it's a signal of masculinity. And Pashtuns, they're kind of contradictory in a lot of ways, but it's a very male-driven culture. It's a very masculine culture, and so having the beard, it helps you. I think in some ways it's maybe an intangible, but I think it helps. It helps you identify a little bit with the other person you're talking to. These guys, the Pashtuns, they take a lot of pride in their beards. If you look at the way that they're manicured, they're brushed, they're clean, dyed in some cases. Yeah, I mean, so I think it made some of our guys, especially younger soldiers or Marines, look even younger than they already were. And I don't think that helped with rapport building. I think it could. It was more helpful to have a beard, look a little more masculine, a little older. It's an intangible. I can't quantify it, but it's just, to me, it's like, from a rapport standpoint, it just made you look more formidable, and it made you blend in a little more. And it's, it's like a psychological trick. You kind of like, you start to identify with people that look like you a little bit more. And we definitely, the soft guys, most of them could have beards, and that probably helped to some degree with them building some relationships and just looking a little meaner, which might have helped in some instances, right? But you guys on the conventional end not being able to do that, like a lot of NATO forces were able to grow beards out. I think the Canadians were able to do that, and some other countries. So I just think it would have helped you guys like just look more, just kind of integrate with the culture a little bit, and just look a little older and a little more formidable. And I think that would have gone a long way. Maybe it's hard to say, but I think it would have helped with interactions when you were in villages to have that kind of presence. But I can't prove that. It's just it's just what I see.
I mean, here's a crazy leap of imagination, but I almost wonder if like the baby-faced 18-year-old smokes your uncle, and then they go back and they're like, "Oh, uncle was killed by a baby, so I've got to like show my manhood and go out and fight back and take vengeance." But if that 18-year-old had a big, thick, bushy beard, they'd be like, "Well, he was killed by a warrior,
right? And
he died an honorable death."
It may not be as crazy of a line of logic as you think.
Yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to know if that's a realistic.
Well, I mean, look at it this way. Imagine we went to war, and like if you got smoked by like a Chinese foot soldier, I'd be like, "Oh my gosh, man, seriously?" But if you got smoked by like a Chinese like tier 1 guy, I'd be like, "All right, you know what? Fair's fair." So I can see that. I don't think that's I don't think that's illogical.
Well, especially in that culture, as so much is wrapped up into the machismo, and the performance of these, what modern American culture would call toxic masculinity. And in a lot of ways, it's not wrong in terms of Pashtun culture. Like it is their conceptions of what is manhood and masculinity is deeply flawed, and that's something that we've touched on a bit here on the podcast too. Is on one hand they're growing out their beards and they're manly men and they go out and they shoot at the Americans, but on the other hand they indulge in some illicit behavior, at least by our perspectives and our conceptions of that. But I think just in general human decency, that is definitely not something that a real man would do. So we've talked about it a little bit, but Matt, I mean, you've definitely gotten a little bit more of an insight on this because of the nature of your job into the rank pedophilia, for lack of a better way of putting it, that just is so absorbed into Pashtun culture, and especially at least in Panjwai in southern Afghanistan, it's so inherently and tied into the culture of it that you have this dynamic of an older man who engages in probably non-consensual sex with a younger boy.
Definitely non-consensual.
Yeah, deeply non-consensual. Yeah. With a younger boy who might be 13, 12,
Maybe, yeah.
So how did that come into your job, in your day-to-day work?
So the first, I had heard about homosexuality and relationships between adult males and boys before I deployed. That was something that was talked about in training at some point. I think for some guys that had been over there before. And the first experience I had seeing that, well, this was between two adult males. I remember I went to an A&A base. I think it was outside of Speen Boldak, and they were planning an operation, and it was Thursday. And Thursday was euphemistically referred to as Man Love Thursday. I don't know if you guys had ever heard that phrase before.
I do remember that. I didn't know there was any factual basis to it, though.
Well, so my understanding was that because you go to mosque on Friday, that Thursday night was party night.
Get your sin on, yeah.
And you would you could do whatever Thursday night, then you go to mosque, you're absolved of your sins. And that was my that was the explanation I was given as to why that happened. But I remember being on this base, And it's Thursday, and seeing these two guys come by, and they're all made up. They're in their uniforms, A&A guys, and got makeup on, fingernails painted. They're holding hands. They look really happy. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, you wouldn't see that in any disciplined military, I don't think. And that was, probably just part of a broader thing that was going on within the unit. But that was the most blatant thing I saw between A&A. And generally speaking, I didn't see a lot of that with the adults. But I mean, I remember on this one district chief of police compound, there was this one kid. He was probably it's hard to gauge age, but he looked way too young to be there, and he's wearing a uniform. So like, it's kind of like a token, like, I'm a police officer kind of thing, like, so we don't question it. But you're looking at this kid and you're like, no, I don't see how this kid is actually old enough to be a cop. There's no way. But he's there and he's hanging around and he's serving tea, and you're like, okay, well, I mean, there's really only one explanation as to why this kid is there. You can't prove it.
Chai boys, tea boys.
Yeah, the term chai boy. And there's also, a term that, and there's actually a pretty good documentary on this. The term is bachabazi, so it translates to boy play, and it's boys that are trafficked by older, wealthier men, and then they dance for them. They dress up in female clothing, and then they're basically pimped out from there. So that, so the whole idea, I guess, is that this is such a intricate subject, right? Because it gets into like, why is it like this? Like, why is this condoned? Why does it? It's an open secret, essentially, right? So like, it's not really talked about, but everybody knows it's happening, and nobody says anything about it. And we can't really do anything about it, because unless you see something happen, I mean, you don't know. So I think, if you try to figure out like where did this come from, you can read historically about instances where rulers in that particular part of the world had relationships that were documented in some historical text with boys. But I don't know if that really ties into modern day Afghanistan. It's kind of hard to make the connection because the culture has changed a lot. People have moved around a lot. I think the explanation is simpler. It's probably just like when you have a repressed society where you don't have interaction that's sanctioned or allowed between men and women. I mean, that aggression, once you have a male that hits puberty and they have all that testosterone and they don't have an outlet for that, it's going to come out somewhere, right? So ultimately, I think ultimately what happened was these older guys that have some money and some power, it was just a natural extension of that, where they had the influence where they were able to, coerce these young boys who were probably, I imagine in all cases, were poor, didn't have much, and they're able to offer them gifts, which, they provide them with. It's not just a straight up, I take you and you do what you want. It's usually like, here's some money, here's some gifts. This will help your family. And they kind of, groom them that way. And then the cycle just repeats itself. And it just seems like it's probably been going on for a while. We really don't know, because the history is so vague in the country on stuff, especially on stuff like this. But it was almost like it was pretty open from what I saw. Like, it was just a step below. There wasn't like, we're going to do something in front of you, but it's like, you got guys walking around with little boys, holding their hands. You're like, you know what's going on. And it just didn't. There wasn't any shame in it. It was, but I think it's the repression piece of it, where you just don't allow any interaction until marriage, and then women are treated like they're just childbearing.
They're just chattel. Yeah.
And so one of the other sayings was that what women are for childbearing or for babies, and boys are for pleasure. And,
right. Yeah, I've heard that one too.
So that was my general impression of it. You guys probably had this happen. You get hit on sometimes.
Well, not me. I was too manly.
Oh,
sure. No, but we did have a couple of dudes, especially Kobos was a frequenter of receiving affection.
Because he was young. He just turned 18.
Super baby faced.
Didn't have a hair on his face. Couldn't grow it if he wanted to.
Big, like squishy cheeks, Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he was dark skinned kid,
Yeah, so he kind of fit that milieu a little bit.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he got propositioned a few times, if I remember correctly.
He did, quite a bit. So it was not an uncommon thing for the younger guys and the more like we were just talking about the more youthful looking fellas to get blatant propositions from these men of power. These men in local district, whatever, the police chief or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why you needed the beards. That would have helped.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a natural progression to that. Like you said, like you were talking when we were talking about the beards, like it imbues masculinity, it imbues power. You're perceived as an adult, you're as a mature warrior, whereas they see Kobos in uniform the same way that we see the kid with the adolescent with the painted nails and the made up face walk around hand in hand with the other innate. That, like, to them, that's like a parallel.
Mm-hmm.
Because that individual hasn't grown his hair out yet either. So to them, it's like, well, that must be their chai boy. And they made that comment. Is that your chai boy? No, that's Kobos.
I mean, no, definitely not our chai boy.
But it was always ironic to me, and maybe ironic is the wrong word. The Taliban launched out of Panjwai by murdering, several warlords who were abusing children. Like
Yes.
that was the origin of the Taliban. Is like some kids had been kidnapped and they were being used as sex slaves, and Mullah Muhammad Omar and his gang of students, Taliban, went out and they killed those guys, and that they became like these local heroes for standing up for these children. And it wasn't just the Afghan police that were doing this. I mean, Taliban commanders and Afghan police were basically the same guys. And they were all engaging in this behavior. So for like this to be a common thing in Taliban-controlled areas, and it's just so at odds with what created the rise of the Taliban.
Yeah.
I guess that's the point I was getting at.
I wonder if it's kind of like the parallel might be to rape in male prisons, right? Could the prisons really stamp it out if they wanted to? They could probably get pretty close, but the reality is that it does give them some level of control over the inmate population to allow certain things to happen. Yeah. And I would imagine that the Taliban, for one, I don't think their reach is as strong as people think it is from a centralized position, right?
Sure, certainly.
So they've got all these entities that they're trying to, these appendages they're trying to control in the periphery from one centralized or a couple centralized Shura locations while we were fighting them. And I imagine there's only so much they could even do if they wanted to try and stop them.
Point.
It's kind of like, well, these guys are pretty much doing what we want them to do. They're fighting. Like, let's not be too hard on them. Like, if this is happening and it's quiet, then we're just going to let it happen. And I imagine that was part of the thought process, that they knew they couldn't control it, and they had to give their guys something because they were just getting,
blown away every
getting their
3 days by
asses
hellfire.
kicked. Yeah. And I think that's probably got something to do with it. It's not going to go away.
Yeah.
Well,
probably the same thing can be said for the drugs.
Yeah.
The Taliban had pretty much stamped out opium production before we showed up. And
Hell,
now,
the former secretary of, let's see, it's in that Ghost Wars book, but it was like some kind of bureaucrat met with the Taliban to discuss exactly that, like stomping out the drug thing before 9/11 happened.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like a few weeks before.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that when we invaded, opium production went up like 1,000,000% over the period of time.
Yeah.
And Taliban, I'm sure, it's the exact same thing. It's like, hey, we can't tell them not to grow opium. It's how they're making money. We need them to make money so they can buy, guns, and so that we can continue wage this war. Like, to me, it has always been a flaw in the Taliban's claim that they are religious, and they're purely a religious entity, because it exposes that they really are a political entity. They're seeking out power. If they were purely a religious entity, that kind of stuff wouldn't be allowed, even passively.
But it's interesting that of all the issues that the U.S. and NATO forces made big PR issues, like women's rights, for example, you would have thought that child welfare would have been something that would have come up at some point. Like this is a pretty big problem, and I want to be clear. I'm not making the assertion that like everyone does this in Afghanistan.
Right. It's definitely not everybody.
But there's a side. I mean, it's fairly commonplace. I think it's fair to say, and nothing was. I don't think anything was ever really publicly said. So I guess the question would be like, well, if you make it an issue, what can you actually do about it, right? So there were certain things that we could do to actually improve the lives of women, at least in some of the more metropolitan areas, that were pretty effective. You know, schools and more relaxed dress standards and just access to healthcare, those types of things that you could control. But with the abuse that was happening in the more rural areas, like what would you actually do to fix that? And I think everyone realized, decision makers realized, and even people on the ground that knew what was going on. Yeah. It's like, what can I actually do about this? Is there any way I can address this that will make any difference? And I think the answer is probably there wasn't much that could be done.
And
unless
frankly, sometimes you had bigger fish to fry.
Yeah.
You know? Sometimes it was about getting back to the cop without getting fucked up. Yeah. So like that. So you had to kind of compartmentalize that this kid is essentially being raped.
Yeah.
And you had to just set that aside and be like, hey, that's part of the culture. That's part of how they operate. But right now, I want to get back to there so that I can take, I'm not getting shot at.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference where the kind of that line gets really blurry is when it goes beyond like, I think I know what's happening there, to like, I know what's happening there and I saw it.
Yeah.
Or I saw or heard or whatever. Like I have more than just like intuition.
Yeah.
And unfortunately I never had to deal with that. I didn't see anything that went beyond supposition. But it happened. There was the SF guy that, they almost ended his career for beating a police chief to a pulp over it.
Yep.
And I think that's one thing that the military did a very poor job of, is there were absolutely times where they knew for a fact it was happening, not like beyond supposition. And the fact that it wasn't a widespread campaign is like, hey, if you see this, tell somebody, because we're the United States of America. We should not be allowing a warlord or a police chief or a politician to remain in power just because we like him if we know that he's diddling kids. Like, that's fucking bullshit. And I know why we did it. I know, everything we just discussed, but I'm not even a religious person. I just have a conscience.
Yeah.
And like, if it blows my mind that the United States of America knew for a fact in many cases that this was going on. And we're like, no, like it wouldn't, it really infuriates me.
Yeah. A lot of people feel the same way. Guys would talk about situations that you couldn't really do anything about, even if like I said, it's not like you knew you didn't see anything, right. But you looked at the situation, you're like, that's just not right. The way it looks, it just can't be right. And ultimately, I don't feel like there were any tools to really address that. And ultimately, you're kind of like, you'd be forced to choose between ruining a relationship with someone that's maybe providing you with intelligence that's keeping your guys safe, and trying to extricate someone from a abusive situation. And that may not even be successful. So you may end up without getting the kid out of that situation. And then you've completely destroyed that relationship. And I think the decision that was typically made was like, we're just not going to we're just going to put blinders on, and this isn't happening. And we can't verify anything. So we're not going to deal with this. And I'm sure there was a way you could address it, but I don't know what would have happened if you'd taken that up the chain of command.
You'd have to be damn sure.
Yeah.
And the parallel that comes to my mind is, we know that the ANA, ANP executed prisoners. Like, there's no question about that. There's so many anecdotes for like, oh yeah, we dropped the prisoner off at the compound, and as we're pulling out the door, we heard 2 shots. Weird. But you didn't see it happen. Mm-hmm. But in the rare instances where you did see it happen, like we did, like on camera, at that point, like, you have to go in and arrest the person.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You have to go and be like, hey, dude, I understand this is Afghanistan, but you've got a camera right there, dude. But that same mentality didn't translate over to the child abuse. Like, even if you had proof, they didn't care. And that's the part that blows my mind. Even if hard proof, we would still rather keep that police chief in power for, like you said, for the value of the intelligence and et cetera, et cetera. But so after, you said about 4 months with the conventional forces.
Yeah.
Then you basically had a complete dynamic shift, and you went and you worked with one of the ODAs over at the district center, right?
Because that's the thing, when you talk about the nature of this job, it's like my first reaction is to think SF. Like, that's just a natural marriage,
should be, yeah.
So what, you got to bridge those two worlds, and you got to spend the majority of your time with SF, right?
9 of the 13 months was with SF.
Okay, yeah. So, you got a good chunk of time with both, but you got to bridge both within the same environment, same place, and more or less a similar mission set and things like that. So, what was that like?
So I agree with you. I think that this role was actually sort of unintentionally tailored for SF. It really makes a lot of sense within what those guys do and how they work. I mean, with their foreign internal defense sort of focus, right? Training, working closely with the local governance and security apparatuses. I found it was easier to do my job with SF because one was that I had better access to people because I was at the district center. So the AOB is kind of like the hub for a number of ODA spokes, if you will. So the AOB is like the local command element, if you will, underneath Special Operations Task Force South, which is at CAF. And then from the AOB, you've got guys out at Bellambi, you've got an ODA in Zare at the time. And so being at the district center was really helpful because I was within walking distance of a lot of the people I actually needed to talk to on a daily basis, right? So that's a huge, it's an access bonus for sure. I don't have to get in the vehicle and drive anywhere, like unless it's for a different purpose. So you've got within that compound, you've got police, you've got local governance, you've got local police, you've got Afghan SF at some point moved in. And then a lot of people just it's the district center. So people come there, right? Like people from all over Panjwai, they have business there. So they come in, they want to talk to the district governor. They want to talk to the DCOP, the district chief of police. So that was just kind of like luck, I guess, in a way that when I moved over and worked with the SF guys, that I had that level of access. The other piece of it was that I had a little more freedom to kind of chart my own course, I think, versus with the conventional forces, there were more layers. There was a little more bureaucracy, if you will, where I didn't have a direct line at all to the commander at Masum Ghar, right? Like he's a busy guy. He's got several hundred people under him, and I would talk to the 3 or the 2, so the operations or intel guys, that were under him, and that was generally where I would kind of get my marching orders. So there were layers of, it made it harder to communicate and figure out what am I actually supposed to be doing? Like, what do you need? Because I felt like I needed a little more face time with the commander. I never got to talk to the guy really. So I think that made it harder to do the job, even though I know those guys speak for him. It's just, maybe it's psychological. But with at the AOB, the Special Forces major that, is in charge there, I'm right next door to him, and I'm talking to him every day. I'm talking to the sergeant major every day, and those are the guys that are tasking me out. So it made it easier to understand expectations, I think, because I knew exactly what they wanted, and I'm sure they were getting tasked from the SOTF in terms of whatever their information needs were. But I just felt like that was a lot easier to understand what the expectations were from the command, and also that we were just able to do things that were a little more relaxed, I guess, in nature. So we could go over to a local district compound and not wear body armor, just go over there in civilian clothes. So you don't look like, you're ready to kill somebody. You don't have all this gear on, you don't have a rifle. You just go over there with your clothes on and a sidearm and a couple guys and an interpreter. And it feels more natural, if you will, to have that sort of interaction. And I thought it was helpful to be able to do that on such a regular basis and have it not feel as formal, and as as militarized, I mean, it's kind of like counter to what you think you're supposed to be doing, but being able to like just kind of go over there and blend in a little more, I think was helpful. And you can do that with SF. You really can't do that with conventional forces. It's not.
We don't blend into anything with a 40 man patrol plowing through the Grape Rose and shooting a death blossom for every warning shot fired at us. Subtle is not in our job description.
Yeah.
So when you were working with the SF guys, obviously you have that single layer of connection to the major. Did that also allow you to get better feedback as far as like what you were doing being effective? Because I imagine in my mind what you're doing, trying to work for a full bird colonel that you're never going to talk to, he doesn't know your capabilities. He doesn't, honestly, he probably didn't care. He probably just like, just give him something to do. Let him go on a patrol to Talocan.
That's how it felt. That's how it felt. Yeah.
But with the ODA, were you able to get some like tangible feedback on what you were doing and how it was making an effect?
Yeah. So, I don't know if I ever. Yeah, he would sometimes kind of give an attaboy if something notable happened. He was so busy that guy worked his ass off. He was up till like 4 a.m. every day. So I didn't expect much from him.
Yeah.
In terms of like feedback, because he was just busting his butt so much. I knew that the reporting that I was including in the sit reps was getting integrated into the broader report that he was sending up to the SOTF. So I knew it was of value, right? It was making some impact. And the best way, honestly, that I gauged that I was doing something right was that they didn't kick me off the base. That was
yeah, good point.
Because I was told by some other guys, they were like, look, if you show up to work with an ODA, and these are small bases, right? They don't have a lot of beds. They don't have a lot of, they have limited supplies. Like if you're just there and you're just taking a spot up, they're going to send your ass home. You're not going to stay there. They're not just going to let you be there. And I knew that. And I saw that happen to a contractor who showed up, and he thought he was just going to kind of hang out and, be with the Green Berets for a while. And like the sergeant major got sick of him after a couple days. I don't know what the guy did exactly. And the guy left the ops in, and he was like, get this guy on the next chopper out of here as soon as possible, just get rid of him. So I was like, okay. Shit. I was like, confirmed. This does happen, right?
Wow.
What was that dude's job?
It was...
Is he an HVAC mechanic?
No, it was something like that. He did some weird stuff. I think he put a USB in one of the computers, and there was a bunch of porn all over it.
Oh God.
And he was he could sew for some reason, and he was making a bulletproof sport jacket. There's all sorts of weird stuff. I don't know. It was supposed to be for the district chief of police as a gift or something.
Oh yeah.
So so he got. So anyways, I remember getting they kind of were feeling me out the first several days I was there.
Yeah.
What they kind of knew what I did, but what do you do? Why are you here?
What is it you say you do here?
the two bombs, yeah. So I got that vibe from the sergeant major in particular. He was a no nonsense guy. I liked him a lot, but he did. He was just very direct and as you kind of would expect from sergeant major. And he asked me a lot of probing questions initially, just trying to figure out what my value was. I think essentially, and then they gave me some responsibility, and did a pretty good job with it. And then kind of established myself after a few weeks. I think they kind of were okay, he can contribute, and he can take some pressure off of us and help with a couple lines of effort that otherwise somebody else has to do.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt can focus on that. And so I kind of just slotted into the niche that they gave me and just went with it. And
so you would patrol with the conventional guys. Did you patrol with SF, or were they even patrolling that much around that time because things were starting to draw down so much?
They didn't go out very well. So the AOB guys did not go out very much. They were pretty much stuck at the AOB. They went out a couple times, but like we would go into the bazaar a few times. Like they were doing elections. We went out there, so that counts. I mean, that's outside the wire, I guess. But the ODAs that were, the spokes from the AOB, those guys were going out, and they were doing a lot of stuff with ALP. So there was a Panjwai ODA, not the AOB, but a Panjwai ODA, and those guys were going out and talking to the ALP a lot. And they were doing more active, sort of missions. But I was
those were the guys that we were working with most of the time. I mean,
yeah,
I think they probably drew down a bit after. So it actually would have been not long after you got there that the EUD guy got killed right outside Masum Ghar. And he was on a mission with the Panjwai ODA.
It was the 7th group dudes too, right?
It was 7th group guys,
yeah.
Because I mean, when we were there, they would patrol here and there, but like you said, they mostly would go and they'd meet up with the ALP. They might go on. I think I always got the impression that they were bored, so if they could find an excuse to go for a short little walk, outside of an ALP checkpoint,
I got the impression that they saw us as their bitches and they were happy to use us for that.
Oh yeah. They
role.
were definitely Brian Kitching was happy to offer us up as their own little strike force.
Oh no, I digress.
Yeah, but I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if not long after that UD guy got hit, they're like, hey, there's really no reason for us to be going out there and patrolling and looking for IEDs, and we have units for that. We need to focus on our mission, which is, like you were mentioning, the FID and the training aspect.
Yeah, I know they did. They went out one time and the vehicle, I guess it was the MATV, I guess. I think that's like the monster truck, right? The
MRAP is the monster, the one that can hold like 8 people in it.
Nah, the smaller, the 4-seater.
That's the MATV. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think they went out and that took an RPG that stuck in it like just kind of lodged itself in it, and everybody got out, but the whole thing was burnt to a crisp.
Ooh.
I have a picture of it somewhere, but it was just like, I just couldn't. I was like, man, I can't believe that. Like, that's crazy. Like it pierced, the armor, started the fire, and then burnt the whole vehicle.
It's insane.
Tires blew, everything. I mean, they had to. So then they got in a big fight, and so I wasn't out on that. But so the point being that they were going out, they were doing some stuff, but most of it was, I think, like training related with the ALP. A lot of it was.
Right.
Yeah. But going out and seeing local elections, how that was done. We took the DGov, provided, probably wasn't great optics, but took him out, provided security for him while he visited the election sites within the bazaar. We're doing that one time. But most of the stuff was a lot of interaction at the district center with either the police under the DCOP or the district governor and his guys. So like almost daily going over there and just like being a fly on the wall, going to all the shuras, trying to build a relationship in particular with the district governor was one of the main lines of effort that I was working on. And then you never know, people would just show up every day to talk to him for whatever reason, disputes, or they were friends, or they were from the same tribe and they wanted to talk about something. So just being present, I think, was actually kind of like half the job, just to see what would happen. But I went out. Most of the times I went outside the wire were with the conventional guys early on, and then it kind of changed and it became almost like a more diplomatic role with the SF guys.
Which, I mean, that speaks to what we were just talking about. Like that role marries so well to the SF mission that it just makes perfect sense that would be an attachment that you would, that the DOD would slap in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
you got to have the flexibility too. Like,
when
you go out with a 40 man infantry platoon and 30 A&A and you got 60 people on the ground, you're like, hey, that guy over there looks interesting. Can I go talk to that guy? They're like, dude, we can't turn this whole train around just so you can go talk to some fucking dude. Yeah. But SF be like, yeah, sure, let's go.
Right.
We got six guys and a dog. Let's go.
Yeah.
It's very different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the guys that we had a very small number of people that worked with SF, a dozen or so that were out, and I think they had some of the greatest success just because it just made sense with the type of job you're doing to have. The only way it worked really well with the guys at Kinjikak because that's company level. It's a lot smaller, and I could kind of be like, hey, I want to go talk to this guy, and they'd be like, all right, go talk to him, and we could do that. But at Masum Ghar, it was just too big and unwieldy, and like the stuff they were doing, it'd be like some high level meeting in Kandahar city at some palace, and like what am I going to do? Right. I can take notes, but there's really nothing I can do at that type.
Yeah, that 1-star general is not going to let you interrupt his conversation with the guy to get a couple questions in.
It was fascinating to see that type of interaction, but like for my job, it didn't. It made sense to be like as independent as possible, and that worked at the company level, and it worked with security force assistance teams as well, because they had a lot of direct interaction with the in my case with border police and with ANA. So linked up with those guys for a little bit and worked with them. Total aside, you can cut this if you want, but got to go out with Albanian special forces a couple times.
Really?
Just like random. Wow. They were in Speen Boldak, and there was like it was like their equivalent. Albania. Yeah, their equivalent of like the Navy SEALs, I think. And these like guys are all like just bear sized, like the biggest dudes, like just massive.
That's what they should be.
Yeah, it's big old, just massive big, Eastern European dudes.
Muscle.
And were they full of hate and anger, or were they pretty chill?
They were pretty. I mean, you could tell they were capable of.
Great violence.
But their commander was a really nice guy. He spoke English. The other guys, I don't think did, and. They all just kind of wore what they wanted to wear. They all had different weapons. Like it was just like whatever they wanted, like their own like setup. And they all were. So I rode with them, and I don't know what we did. We went out and did something, and I was like, they were like, "Yeah, you're gonna go with the Albanian guys." And I was like, "Oh, all right, sounds good."
Does my Terp also speak Albanian?
Yeah. So they put me in the back of a MRAP with those guys, and. I don't know if I just assumed they knew what they were doing. And
now those guys are out, doing raids in Azerbaijan. Blowing away goat farmers.
Yeah, right.
But it's
always amazing to me that all the different military units
Romanian,
that participated.
Slovakian.
Yeah. The freaking UAE had Apaches flying. Like the idea of like an Arab country flying Apaches and killing people. It just blows my mind. Yeah. It's just so wild to me.
I always thought when you went back to CAF and you went to the boardwalk and you saw like all the different forces like walking around, it was like the equivalent of the bar scene in Star Wars, with all these like different people. It was so weird.
Yeah.
Just such a that whole scene was so bizarre. Like when you like come back from like being out in Panjwai and then you go to CAF and there's like TGI Fridays.
The TGI, exactly.
You get your rifle slung over your back, and you got a smoothie in one hand and a piece of pizza the size of your head in the other. You're like, this is gonna hurt tomorrow, but fuck it.
I just remember. So to give you a little background, Matt. Like I joked about growing up Southern Baptist, but I grew up going to Romania in the summers between school on mission trips. So when I would go to CAF and I'd see these Romanian soldiers and I'd just like lay down a little bit of Romanian on them and they'd be like, holy fuck, like this is an American soldier that can speak Romanian. Like it was a very multicultural, multinational scene there. It was pretty cool actually, think about it. Albanians apparently too.
Yeah, a little bit of everything. I think there were Romanian guys at Masum Ghar, I think they
they were. I think there was a couple dudes stomping around there. Yeah, the Romanians were the first country to plead to the coalition of the willing. I
think they were the last ones to duck
leave.
out.
Yeah,
because they were still there in 2017. They were the ones doing. They were responsible for the immediate security of CAF. It wasn't Americans. It was Romanians going on a patrol.
Romanians love Americans. They do. Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I saw, they had built a smoke shack. Like they built this little tiny shack that they could like just sit in. I don't know why you would do this because you can just smoke outside, but they did it. And then they would fly remote control planes around, and that was it.
Really interesting.
On the airfield?
No. This was at Masum Ghar.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it was always neat to work with all the different organizations. And as you mentioned, you run into them all over the place. Masum Ghar, District Center. But going back to your time at the District Center, it wasn't completely quiet the whole time. You did have kind of one major infraction.
Yeah, we had I think it was in July of 2013. We had there was a complex attack on the base. So to understand that, you have to understand that when I'm saying District Center, so it's like it's 4 walls, but within those 4 walls, there's multiple compounds. It's not that big of an area, but you've got the American Special Forces. Next to them, you have the Afghan National Police. Next to them, you have the district governor and his facilities in the Shura Hall. Next to that, you used to have American Conventional Forces, but they left in June or July of 2013. So Afghan SF and that compound moved in, and then you have Afghan local police, and they've all got their own little compounds, right? Just to set it up. And so, these 2 guys drove in a sedan, and they got to the exterior gate, which is manned by Afghan police. And these guys were wearing uniforms, and they basically told them that they had a meeting with the district chief of police, and they needed to get in. They let him in. They drove in. They parked their car in an alley right in front of our gate, the American SF gate. They got out. They walked around to another checkpoint that gets you into a different part of the compound, and they talked their way past those guys. And then they got to the last compound gate checkpoint, which gets you into the Shura Hall and the district governor's offices. And the district governor was meeting with some guys in the Shura Hall area when these 2 guys approached. And they got to this last guard. It's just one guy at this last checkpoint, and they showed him I think they had a pistol, a small arm of some kind, and they showed him that they had suicide vests on, and they said, "Hey, we're here to kill the district governor. If you don't want to die, just let us go past." They didn't kill the guy, and so he let them go past, and he waits, and then when they get 10, 15 feet past, and they're almost in there, they're almost there to the mission, the police guy turns around and he shoots them both in the back.
I love it.
Brilliant. And so they both are dead. One of the guys falls down face first, dead. The other guy falls down, but he detonates. And I guess detonated into the ground. So luckily the police officer there, the A&P guy, did not even get hurt. Didn't take a piece of shrapnel or anything. And then meanwhile, there's this vehicle that's sitting in front of the U.S. Special Forces gate, and we've taken note of that. It's sitting there, and send in EOD, and he goes out there and gets the robot, sends that out. Which is amazing how those things work. They can open doors and cameras, and we're watching all this from the ops end, from the raid camera, so we can see everything that's happening, and we can hear the radio.
This is nuts.
Yeah, it is. We can hear all the communications, and he's not able to find. He's trying to find the explosives and the wiring and stuff with the robot, right? And he can't find it. So he's like, "All right, well, I'm gonna have to go in," and he puts on the Hurt Locker suit and waddles out there, and he's trying to look for the explosives, and a phone starts ringing in the car while he's doing that. And
that's when your asshole puckers couldn't get a toothpick in there.
Yeah, we're all just watching this like it's like a bad reality TV. Like we can see and hear everything that's happening, and we're not that far away.
Right, that's the thing that's blowing my mind. You're like 50 feet away. I mean, if that's like a 2,000-pound IED, like
potentially
nowhere on that place is safe.
Yeah. So this phone starts ringing, and he's like, the EOD guy is very calm. It's amazing. Like he's just like, there's a phone ringing. And we're thinking like some of the guys start talking, and they're like, is that supposed to be happening? Shouldn't we be jamming like all this stuff. Like, I don't know anything. I'm not an EW expert. I don't know how this works.
You're right. It should be jammed. There should be no cell. Well, that was weird. Is they had the jammers, and jammers were supposed to prevent all that stuff. Yet at the same time, at Masum Ghar, all the time, ANA are on their cell phones.
Oh.
So most of that shit is fucking classified. So even if I knew it, I couldn't talk about it. But clearly, it left much to be desired, or they had certain times when they turned it off. I have no idea.
I don't know. I don't know what the resolution was to that, but it's
terrifying.
People that noted that it didn't seem right that should have been happening. So it may not have been connected to like detonating the bomb, but it may have been too, right? So who knows? But nothing happened. It didn't go off. He finds the explosives that are packed under the seat and the wiring. He said it was about 300 pounds of explosives, and disables it. And then they tow the vehicle off to a field in front of the district center and blow it. And it was a big boom.
That.
Yeah, it was fun. It was a big explosion. And then the Afghans, going back to the suicide bombers, they took the guy that was intact and they just threw him out on the side of the road in front of the district center, like medieval times, just to like putting a head on a
pike. Yeah.
Just wait, just come pick him up. Right. Just like a challenge. And it was, there was a big Shura the next day, and they really didn't clean anything up. And this is at the Shura Hall. They just kind of hose things down, but there was such a, you can imagine, I mean, it's just gore everywhere. It's puddles of blood everywhere. It's July. I mean, it stinks. And
it smells nice.
It's pretty bad. But I guess the idea was that they were thinking with that vehicle that we, not me, but the Green Berets would respond to gunfire and explosions at the district center, and they would walk out, and then they would detonate the IED and kill them all. So, but luckily, no one took no ANA casualty, no Afghan casualties, no American casualties. Bombs disabled. I mean, it couldn't have been any better under the circumstances. But yeah,
that would have been a huge deal if that had been.
That would have been that'd have been a pretty
massive
significant
deal. You get
attack.
the DGov, you take out half an ODA from the inside of a district center.
Yeah, that's one of those instances
terrifying
where you get a lot of threat reporting, right? And it almost becomes so commonplace that you just start to like not pay attention to it as much. Like, like they say something's going to happen and it never happens. That leading up to that event, we'd actually gotten there was a bunch of reporting that said something was going to happen in Panjwai. So normally, myself and another guy would go over to meet with the DGov around like between 9 and 10 in the morning, and we got kind of rich. We got routinized about it. We were doing it consistently way too often, and we talked about a couple days before this attack happened. We were like, we need to vary our times a little bit because this is getting way too predictable. And sure enough, a couple days later, they hit it. I think the attack happened around 9:45, 10 o'clock. I was like, well, maybe they were trying to see if they could get a couple more people inside. We certainly would have been over there under normal circumstances. And says Lucky dodged an IED or a suicide vest on that occasion. So it was
So I think this is a good chance to shine a light on the civilian contribution to the war effort in Afghanistan. So one of the things that you informed us about the people in your job is that you guys had people that were killed in the line of duty. And so I think we should take a moment to kind of tell those people's stories a little bit, what you know, and just kind of realize that these are people who didn't necessarily sign up for that kind of exposure, but who ultimately ended up paying that sacrifice, because everybody immediately thinks about the soldiers who died in war, but people often forget that in this most recent conflict that civilians were intricately tied up into many, many aspects of it. And I don't know, how many civilians have been killed in Afghanistan? American civilians, there's no telling. A few. A good number would be a good guess. So, it's something that was part of your job, was an inherent risk involved in that, exposing yourself to those kinds of risk for this job. So, Could you give us a little bit of a detail about what you do know about what happened to some of your colleagues and some of the folks in your program?
Yeah. So while I was there, luckily, I don't think any of my training cohort were killed or wounded. I know one of my good friends was involved in an explosion but didn't have any significant injuries. Another complex attack actually on the base he was at, where it blew him out of a shower naked, which is kind of funny in retrospect. But yeah, I mean, you think about the nature of the job, like you're supposed to be going out on essentially combat operations, right? So even though that's not your job to do that, you're putting yourself in those positions potentially where something could happen. And there were 3 people that I know of prior to they were not there at the time I was there, but that were killed. One in Iraq at a meeting. It was an IED that went off. I think it was in Baghdad. Was killed in the blast. There was a guy in Afghanistan who was killed in an IED explosion as well, I believe. And there was a woman in Afghanistan that was in a village that was actually burned to death by a local villager.
Burned alive, right?
Burned alive, yeah. Yeah.
And you said that one, it was like, it wasn't even necessarily a Taliban guy. He was just offended by her presence.
Yeah, it's not really.
I mean, he probably was Taliban, but I mean.
He could have been. It's hard to know because the guy's dead. What happened was she was in the village doing interviews. I think this was in eastern Afghanistan. And a guy, best you can tell, took offense to her being a woman, being in the village. Just being there. Yeah. And he poured fuel of some kind on her and then set her on fire.
Oh my God.
So her team leader chased the guy down and shot him. So
good.
Yeah. So so it's motivation's hard to gauge, but it's probably either Taliban, hated women, or both, and he just did what he did. So yeah, I think she survived initially, but she died. I believe she died several weeks later from the injuries. So yeah, there's not a lot of civilians out there, or there weren't, but there were some, that were actually in more forward locations. And I don't know what casualty numbers look like at all. I just know anecdotally. I know the 3 people that were killed. I don't know how many people were, took significant injuries.
Yeah.
At least doing the stuff I was doing. So I don't know what the stats are on that at all. But there's definitely people out there that were putting themselves at risk. And
I mean, you had Homeland Security and the DEA, FBI, other federal law enforcement agencies. You had people like yourself that were DOD employees. You had contractors, going out and servicing the blimps or repairing Crow systems. I mean, that's it's like the great lie of the modern war on terror. Especially when we went through this phase where we were obsessed with troop numbers. We only have 12,000 troops in Afghanistan. Well, no, we don't, because maybe there's 12,000 people that have a military IED with a rank on it, but there's 3 times as many people servicing airplanes and filling fuel and going out on patrols with SOF and collecting information, or doing counter narcotics operations, or servicing Afghan Blackhawks, or you name it. So to pretend that the war on terror was a purely military effort, it's just wrong.
Mm-hmm. It's a unique attribute of this particular war, was that civilians were so prevalent everywhere you went. Even out in the boonies in Panjwai, we had civilians around. We had freaking laundry facility on Special Forces. Yeah, like these poor dudes from the Philippines who were up there making probably $7.50 an hour instead of $2 an hour. Right. And if Special Forces had been not on a mountain, they could have gotten rocketed and mortared and everything else. So yeah, it's pretty remarkable, really.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of law enforcement professionals doing training missions that I ran into.
Yeah.
Which is not, it's not necessarily going out, maybe not necessarily going outside the wire a whole lot, but there's that green on blue threat to me is in some ways just as risky as, getting shot on a patrol, right? Because you can't see any of that coming at all.
Mm-hmm.
You just so you think about it, but it's like, well, the best I can do is like try to be cool with these guys, and if they like me, maybe they won't shoot me.
That's the strategy.
Yeah.
Did you find yourself running into a lot of fellow civilians while you're out there? I mean, did you guys kind of like walking down the boardwalk and be like, "You're not"? No, just everybody you were around was pretty much military.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, once at Masum Ghar, there were a fair number of civilians there. It's much bigger base, right? So, law enforcement professionals, some intel people, contractors of different stripes. But once I got out to the AOB, there was one intel analyst that was a contractor, and and there was another guy. I won't even like hint at what but he was doing some other stuff, and that was it. Other than there were interpreters, obviously, but
sure,
and people that were local nationals helping clean stuff and cook and that sort of thing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But it was with the SF guys. It was just me and the other contract analysts that were the only. I think we were the only two civilians that were in like the kind of the ops end with the core of the team there. So it's pretty unusual.
Pretty small company.
Yeah.
So as you drew that whole experience to a close, and as we draw the episode kind of to a close, we kind of like to give our guests the chance to either reflect on their experience or just bring up any kind of points that we didn't have a chance to talk about during the normal episode. So from here to the end of the episode's kind of the floor is yours, man.
Well, I do want to say that one thing that not that I didn't think this going into it, but the professionalism and the decency and the work ethic of both the conventional guys I worked with and the SF guys was fantastic. We've got a great military, and I saw really nothing but guys trying to dedicate it to doing the job, trying to do the best they could, doing it under difficult circumstances. And I felt like people treated me, even though I was a civilian, and I knew that there was probably some bias, dealing with a civilian, that it wasn't hard. Once people saw that you were willing to work hard and support, that that any bias that was there seemed to go away pretty quickly. And it was just about the camaraderie and the teamwork was something that I haven't experienced anywhere else I've ever worked in my life. It's such a unique environment. And so I really enjoyed working with both the conventional and the SF guys. It's different experiences, but it was fantastic, and I'm glad I did it. And I would have done whatever was required to support their missions while I was there. So I wanted to mention that. Also that, seeing what's happened over the last couple months and Taliban taking over Afghanistan, I'm sure you guys, it was a hard couple of weeks to watch that, especially the last couple of weeks of it. At least it was for me. Just kind of this like, I knew things weren't going to end well there. Like it wasn't like we were going to win, quote unquote.
Right.
But it was really hard to watch. But still, I don't think it was for nothing. I think there were a lot of things that happened that were positive. There's so much transformation that happened within Afghanistan from, when we initially went in 2001 to when we left just a couple months ago, that I'm hoping will allow the country to somehow navigate past where it's at right now, which is in a really bad spot. And that some of the seeds of, Western democracy, liberalism, whatever you want to call it, have been planted, and that younger generation that's actually had a relatively peaceful existence, those that are, say, under 30 years old, maybe that's an opportunity for something to change within the country. So, if service members or other people that have served over there are looking at the situation and they're dismayed by it, I'm not one of those people that says it was all for nothing. I do think that there were positives that came out of it, outside of the obvious counterterrorism piece of it. And just say not to judge the situation quite yet. It's not, things aren't set. It's a fluid situation. And I think all the sacrifice was not in vain. I think that you could still see things change for the better. May not look like this country, it's going to be different, but I don't think it was all for nothing. So, that's the way I choose to look at it.
Yeah, well, we certainly reflect and appreciate that sentiment. I mean, it's literally on our little badge. T-shirt. Yeah, it's on the T-shirt of it was not a waste. It wasn't a waste. And there's a part of me that hopes that young woman in Kandahar, or better yet, young woman in Kabul, who was my age when we invaded, now is a 30-something-year-old woman who has lived a real life over the past 15 years because of our presence there. So, you would hope that cements something in that person's mind, and they're able to act counter to what has resulted.
It's a good point you mentioned to me. The story's not done yet.
No,
the fall of Afghanistan happened in the fall, going into the winter. The NRF is not done. Saddam Massoud is not done fighting. The Taliban is already fighting, infighting within their own organization as well as fighting ISIS.
Yeah.
There are a lot of parties that have a lot of interest in the Taliban not being in charge.
That's right.
And I think springtime is going to be the Taliban should enjoy what they have right now.
Yeah.
Because they have it easy right now. No one's fighting them. They got to figure it out on their own. They got their own disputes to figure out. But when spring comes around, it's not going to be easy again.
No. And if the question, if you're asking yourself, when in relatively recent history has a centralized power been able to control all of Afghanistan, the answer is never.
Never.
It's never happened. And the Taliban, I think people might overestimate how able they are, how capable they are to actually extend into some of these territories that they don't have traditional seats of power in. And that includes areas where ISIS is out in the middle of nowhere, in, the mountains in the east and the northeast, Nuristan, for example, to think that I don't have a lot of, I certainly don't want ISIS to win, but I don't have a lot of confidence that the Taliban are going to be able to project power into some of these far-flung areas. And that, like you said, you could see some resistance movements start to gain a little bit of traction. And, people like to pick a winner, especially in Afghanistan. And once you start seeing the scales tip a little bit, you can have all sorts of changes happen. So it's not over.
And the Taliban has such a tradition of splits and shelves. You got the Haqqanis, you've got ISIS. I mean, ISIS is basically just all the super conservative Taliban that don't like what the current Taliban is doing. They're not even really ISIS. You're just like, well, I still want to be a bad guy. I want to be badder than those guys. So we'll fly under the black flag instead of the white flag.
Yeah.
So I like your sentiment there. The Afghanistan story is not written yet. I certainly don't want to write off the 39 million and 3/4 Afghans that aren't Taliban, because they want to fight. If someone's willing to give them the means and the assistance, they will fight, and they will push them out of Kabul at some point. That's my prediction.
Yeah, they're not. I mean, Afghans are not. They're not cowards, and they are fighters. I mean, people have made a lot of proclamations about what happened with the security forces when the Taliban took back over. That really has nothing to do with whether there's the will to fight or not. It's just
they had no ammo.
I mean, it's just I mean, they
had no supplies. I don't blame them. I would give it up too.
And they're SF guys. God bless them. Those guys, a lot of those guys fought to the end because they knew there was no other. And
their surrender is not going to be accepted.
No. And so people chose to look at the instances where forces just rolled up, and that did happen. But there were also instances where they fought as hard as they could for as long as they could. But you can't, like you said, you can't fight without bullets. So
that's what happened at Masum Ghar. They fought until they were out of food and they were out of water and they were out of ammo, and they're like, we got to go. And they flew Blackhawks in and took them up to Bob Wilson. But they fought to the end. But there were a lot of places, especially a lot of the really tiny bases, where they're like, we haven't had a resupply in 6 months.
Yeah.
We pulled out and we said, hey, you guys got this, but even though we've been your entire logistics chain for the past 15 years, you got to figure that one out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it sucks. So yeah, I like it. We're not going to count them out. Matt, thank you. This is one of the more, probably, I'm going to say the most unique viewpoint that we've had on the podcast.
Very insightful.
And refreshing, because it's, as much as we love our military bros, it's really nice to see the other side.
It is.
And to get a perspective that's not tainted by our cult.
Yeah. Not tainted by the determination to wreak violence upon all and
yes. Yeah. Right.
Well, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate what you're doing. Like I said when we talked a couple days ago, I think basically what you're creating is like an oral history of, you know, a particular facet of the conflict. And I don't think anybody else is doing anything like that as far as I've seen. So it's I think historically it'll be a unique document, if you will, that'll actually help people understand, like, at least what this one little piece of the war was like.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope I did it justice while my memory's still good. And I appreciate, don't get a chance to talk about this stuff very often. So I appreciate you guys having me on. And I think it's a great project.
Great. Appreciate it, Matt.
Yeah, thanks.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Season 3 of the Panjwai Podcast. We appreciate you sticking with us all the way to the end of the episode. But just one more thing before you go, please hit the like and subscribe button and make sure that you are following us on our social media.